Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created with Phaser 3. Previously, we wrapped up polishing our battle scene by adding in our custom scene transition for when the battle starts. If you missed the previous videos, there will be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There will also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Alright, so now that we wrapped up our battle scene polish, it's time for us to start working on our world scene. And so here is where we're actually going to create our world where our player will be able to move around, they'll be able to interact with NPCs, interact with interactable objects like signs, they'll be able to enter buildings, they go into grassy areas, encounter wild monsters, and so much more. So to get started, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to update the assets we'll be using for our game. So in the GitHub page, under the game assets release, there is a zip folder called world scene assets. And so this has a variety of assets that we're going to need for our world scene, as well as a few other things that we'll need later on. And so in the description of this video, there's going to be a link to a direct download to the zip folder. But if you come to this page under the world scene assets, this is where you can grab that. So in the assets folder, there are a few new assets. One of them is by Axelart, and it's for this 8-character direction pack here. And so we're going to be using this pack to create our main character. And so this comes with the sprite animations that we need for moving our character in a variety of directions. And so we'll be using this. And we're going to be using this classic retro RPG character pack, and we'll be using this for creating our NPCs in our game. So just want to give credit to both Parallel Games and Axelart for these assets that we'll be using in our Monster Tamer game. Alright, if you can go ahead and download that zip folder and extract it, what you should see inside, there's going to be two main folders under our assets. One is going to be data, and this is going to be a level JSON file. This is going to have the data we need for our world, and we're going to cover more on this later, but we just need to make sure that file is added to our project. And then under images, this is where all of our new game assets are for our images. So we have Axelart, we have our custom character that we'll use for our player. Under Kenny, there is a new glass panel UI element, as well as a custom colored variations of this. And so under Monster Tamer, there'll be a map folder, and this will be some of the assets we'll be using for our actual scene. And then UI, we have a new cursor, and then we have a new title, and then we'll have a new title folder. This is going to have all the assets for when we actually build out our title scene later. Finally, under Parallel Games, this will have our NPC character sprite sheet. And so for importing in this data, what we need to do is we just need to go ahead and place these in the folder path that's outlined in the zip folder here. So we come back to our game. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and add our assets. All right, so after you move your assets over, what we should have in our source code is under our assets folder, under data, we should have our new level.json. Under images, we should have our Axelart folder with the character subfolder. Under Kenny's assets, we should have UI space expansion, and then we should have our new glass panel with the green and purple variations. Under Monster Tamer, we should have our new map subfolder with our 4 images, and we should have our UI with our title, with our 3 images, and our new cursor white. Then finally, we should have Parallel Games, where we should have our characters, and then the notes with just the credits. Alright, so now that we have our assets in place, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create our scene. So let's go ahead and jump into our scenes folder, and under our scenes, let's make a new file, and we're going to call this world scene.js. And let's go ahead and export out our class, and this will be world scene, and we're going to extend our phaser scene. And then what we'll do is we need to go ahead and update our constructor. So if we can jump over to our battle scene, what we're going to go ahead and do, let's come up to our constructor real quick. And we're just going to copy that logic, and let's go ahead and paste it here. And then what we'll do is let's update our import to use scene keys. And then we'll need to go ahead and update our scene keys object to have our new scene. So let's go ahead and add in our world scene. And we'll copy the same value. And then what we'll do is let's jump back to world scene, and we'll update the key that's used. So then let's come into our configuration for our game. So if we go into our main.js file, let's go ahead and add in our new scene. So we're going to copy this line here, we'll paste, and let's add in world scene, and we'll update to point to our class. So we'll import world scene. And then what we'll do, let's jump back to world scene, and let's go ahead and add our phaser imports. We're just going to copy this line. We'll add it to the top of our file. Oh, and let's go ahead and fix our import. And then finally, what we want to do is let's jump to our preload scene, and we're going to update our preload scene to point to our world scene instead of our battle scene. And then that way, when the scene starts, it should be black, so we have nothing in our scene currently. All right, so for our world scene, the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and add in our background that we'll be using for our world. So let's go ahead and add our create method. And in our create method, what we'll do is we will go ahead and add a image game object. So we'll do this.add image. And then what we'll do is let's add our position. So we're going to do 0, 0 to go in the top left-hand corner. For our texture, we're going to need to go ahead and create a new asset, and then we'll need to load these in. So let's do world asset keys, and we will do world background. And we will go ahead and do frame 0, and then let's just do our set origin, and we'll set to 0. And what we'll do is let's copy this. Let's come up into our assets folder and go to our asset keys, and we'll go ahead and add that. So we're going to do export const our new object name, and we'll do object.freeze. And then we want to go ahead and add in our new property. So we'll have world background, and we'll set that to the same value. Then back in our world scene, we'll go ahead and add that import. And we'll just bring that down below phaser. All right, so now that we have our new asset, what we actually need to do is come into our preload scene and then load in that file. So let's go ahead and come down to our preload scene. And then at the bottom of our create method, after we load in our attack, let's go ahead and load world assets. And so this is just going to be an image. So we'll just copy this line here, paste it down here. And so we will do our world asset keys, our background. For our path, this is going to be our map, and then level background.png. All right, so now when our scene refreshes, we should see our image is now loaded into our game. All right, so what we'll do real quick is let's come back to our world scene, and we're just going to go ahead and update our create method to have our log line to align with some of our other scenes. If we come to our preload scene, we come to the top of our preload method. Let's copy our console log. We'll add that to our create method, and we'll go ahead and update our class reference. All right, so now that we have our background image shown, what we're going to work on next is adding in our player game object. And so for that, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a couple new classes. The first one is going to be our character class. And so this is going to be a base class that we'll be able to reuse for our player and for our NPCs. So for both of these, they're going to have very similar properties. So they'll have a position, they're going to be sprites, they're going to be able to move around our game, they'll be animated. And so we're going to go ahead and have our character class will have that commonality between the two, and then with player and then NPCs having their own logic. So very similar to what we did with our monster and then our enemy and player monster classes. So go ahead and do this. Let's make a new folder under our source code, and we're going to call this world, and we'll place all of our code here for our world scene inside here. Then let's make a new subfolder, and we're going to call this characters. And under characters, we'll go ahead and make a new file called character.js, and we'll go ahead and export our class, and this will be a character. And then what we'll do is in our constructor, we're going to expect a configuration. So we'll have our config. What I'm going to do is going to add it to do. And then let's go ahead and create our player class. So we'll have player.js in our world characters subfolder. And we're going to copy this. Let's go ahead and paste it. We'll update our class name to be player. And we're going to do extends, and we'll do character. And then let's go ahead and call our super method, and we'll pass in our config. All right, so for our characters, we'll need some of our common things that we usually get, and that's going to be our phaser scene, so we'll create our game objects. We're going to need our asset key for our sprite game object we create. We'll support passing in a frame, so if it's a sprite sheet, we can grab a particular frame. And then finally, we'll need a position for where to place our game object in our scene. All right, so let's just go ahead and add our types real quick for that. So what we'll do is for our param config, And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a new type. And so we're going to do character config. And then what we'll do is come to the top of our class. Let's go ahead and add in that type def. And this will be a character config. And we will have a type. And this is going to be an object. And then we'll have our properties. So we'll have property. First one's going to be our phaser scene. We'll call that scene. And then we'll have our asset key, asset frame. So let's just copy this here. We're going to paste it. I'll do one more. So after our scene, we are going to have our asset key. We will then have our asset frame, and we will make this optional with the default value of 0. And then we're going to have our position. And then for our types, asset key will be a string, asset frame will be a number, and then position is going to be our coordinate. And then what we'll do inside our constructor is we'll go ahead and assign these properties. So first, let's go ahead and add our phaser scene, and then we'll go ahead and do our phaser game object. And so actually for both these properties, what we'll want to do is we're going to make these protected. So similar to what we did in our base monster class, we're going to want these to be protected and not private so we can access them. And then what we'll do in our constructor is we're going to go ahead and assign those. So we'll have our scene equal to our config.scene. And then we'll have our phaser game object equal to this, our scene. We'll do add and we'll do sprite. And now we need our positions. We'll do config.position.x, config.position.y. And now for our asset, we'll grab that from our config. So we'll have our asset key. And then we'll do our frames. We'll do our asset frame, or we will fall back to 0 if one was not provided. And then real quick, let's go ahead and just add in these types so we have them. So we'll do at type, and this will be our phaser.scene. And then our game objects will have at type. And we'll have phaser game objects dot sprite. All right, so now that we have our logic in place for our base character class, let's jump over to our player class. And so for our player, what we're going to do is for our configuration, we're not going to require all of our properties that we've defined here. Instead, our player class will be responsible for providing the asset and the frame that we want to use for our player. And we want to actually pass that through when we create our player instance. And so to do that, what we'll do is we're going to add a new type definition here. And it's going to be for our player config. So let's go ahead and add that in. And we'll do add type def. And we are going to call this player config. And so now the type for our player config, we want this to be our character config, but with a few of our properties not being required. And so to do that, we'll go ahead and add in our type. So we're going to have omit, and then we'll have our little brackets here. And now we need to go ahead and reference our character config. So we will go ahead and grab that type. And so this is going to be the base. So what this will do is it's going to basically create a copy of this type here. And so what we're saying is character config is going to be our base. And so right now we have our phaser scene, our asset key, and our optional frame, and then our position. And what we can do is if we want to remove a value, we would say we want to remove asset key. And then what that's going to do is on our player config, now this type will not have this value. And then what we should be able to do is if we go ahead and add in our param for our constructor, we'll update our type. So we're no longer going to do character config, we're going to do player config. And then what's going to happen right away is our IDE is going to tell us, hey, our player config cannot be assigned to our character configuration because we're missing a required property, and that's our asset key. And if we added additional types here, then what will happen is it's going to also inform us, hey, we're missing properties. And so what we'll do is we just need to go ahead and update our configuration we're passing to our super method. And so what we'll do is we're just going to make a new object. We're going to make a copy of the config param that's passed in by using our spread operator. And then we'll add in our missing properties that are not provided. And so we'll add an asset key, and for the time being, we're just going to do an empty string, and then we'll go ahead and do our asset frame that's optional, and we'll do 7. And since we want to pass an asset frame here, we're going to go ahead and add that up here as well. So we'll do or, and we'll do asset frame. And now in our IntelliSense, if we hover over player config, we'll see we have scene and position, versus if we come back to character and we hover over character config, you see we have all 4 properties. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and load in our asset for our characters. So let's come to our asset keys. And first, let's go ahead and define these. So let's copy this code here. We're going to go ahead and paste it. And we are going to call this character asset keys. And inside here, we are going to have our player. And then we'll have NPC. And then if we can jump over to our preload scene, let's go ahead and load in these assets. So after we load in our world assets, what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and load in our character assets. So we're going to do load character images, and we are going to do sprite sheets. So let's copy this here. I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And so we will do our character asset keys, and let's do our player first. And for our path, this is actually going to be under Axle Art. So what we'll do is we'll come up to where we created some of our variables, and let's add these in. So we are going to have our Axle Art asset path. And so this will be assets images, and it will be Axle Art. And let's go ahead and make one for our Parabellum games. And so we'll have assets images, and it'll be Parabellum games. And we'll update our variable to be PB games asset path. Then let's come back down to where we're creating our player, and we will do our Axle Art asset path, and we'll do character, and it will be custom PNG. And so for our frame width, this is going to be 64 pixels, and our height is going to be 88 pixels. And what we'll do is let's copy this. Let's do our NPC. And so we'll have our NPC, and this is going to be our PB games asset path, and there will be no subfolder, and we will call this characters.png, and these are going to be 16 by 16 for our frame width and height. All right, so then let's jump back over to our player class and let's fix our asset key. So for our asset key, this is going to be our character asset keys, and we are going to use player. Let's get rid of our to-do, and let's go ahead and save. All right, so now that we have our new classes, we need to go ahead and actually create an instance of our player. So what we'll do is we'll come over to our world scene. Let's add a new property to our game. We're going to call this player, and we'll make it private. And then we will come down into our create method after we load in our background. Let's go ahead and create our player instance. So we will do this. Our player is going to be equal to new player. And then we need to go ahead and provide our configuration. And so for our scene, it's going to reference this. And then position, we need to go ahead and provide our player position. And so for that, we're going to make a new variable. So we're going to do player position, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and define this as an object out of our class. So we're going to do const player position will equal to object.freeze, and we are going to do x. We'll do 1, and for y, we're going to go ahead and do 1 as well. And then for this, let's go ahead and add in our type, and this will be a coordinate. All right, if we go ahead and save our code, let's come over to our scene. We should be able to test our changes. And so we should see our player game object, and it's appearing off the screen. And that makes sense because we're using a position of 1, 1. And then based on our origin, that's going to go ahead and position our game object over here off the screen. And so what we actually need to do is update our position. And so what we're going to do for placing game objects in our world scene is we're going to go ahead and use a grid system. And basically what that means is instead of having to calculate all of our X and Y values, we're going to use coordinates of like 1, 2, 3, 4. And then what we're going to do is we're going to multiply those by the size of our tiles. And then that way, it'll make it a lot easier to align this with our data later that we're going to be using in tiled. And it's going to make it easier for moving and keeping track of which grid our object is currently in our game. And so this will be useful for when our player's moving around and we want to check for possible collisions in the position that the player wants to go to. It'll also be helpful for NPCs when they're moving around so they don't collide with the player. And so for us to go ahead and do that, our current tile size is 64 pixels. So we're just going to make a new variable, and we're going to call this tile size, and we'll set it equal to 64. We're going to go ahead and multiply our grid position here, so our 1, 1, by our tile size. And what this should do is this is going to move our player to that first position, so 1, 1. And so our current tile would be like 0, and then we'd have 1, 2, 3, likewise 0, 1, 2, 3. And so our character's been moved over. However, it looks like our origin is not actually updated properly. So if we can come back to our character class, what we're going to do is after we create our sprite, let's go ahead and call the set origin, and we're going to set this to 0. And so this is going to be important for our grid-based movement because when we have a coordinate, we want our image, our game objects to be aligned with that top left corner. And so now our character's position where we want them to be. So if we jump back to our world scene, just to see an example, if we do like 0, 0, we should be here in the top left-hand corner. If we do 1, it should bump our character over 1. And then like if we do 2, it's so on and so forth. It should just keep moving that character over by 64 pixels. And then that way, we don't have to manually know those values. And if we ever wanted to change the tile size of our game, all we should have to do is update this value here and then move our game objects accordingly. All right, so now that we have our world scene set up, we have our assets loaded, and we have our background and our player game object loaded, that actually brings an end to this video. In our next video, we're going to start adding in support for our player input, and then that way we can move our game object around our scene. And so we're going to be looking at how we can refactor some of our existing logic to reuse what we're using for input in our battle scene. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.